World history is obviously very tricky to teach because the world is very large. There are a lot of countries, a lot of people, and it's a matter of what are you going to include. Some instructors try to touch on every single country, every single group of people, and inherently it means you are skimming over every one of them. I'm not going to say that there is a right and a wrong way to do this, because there isn't. But for this course, we will not be doing that. For the lecture videos, we will be covering some broad themes and broad concepts that are vitally important to know by hyper-focusing on the countries and the regions that have the largest influence on the rest of the world. So we can examine and understand how and why those countries, those areas, those regions were successful long term. The textbook covers the specific parts of the areas and the regions that we will not be discussing in the lectures. So in this lecture, we will be looking at the overview of the eras we're talking about. We'll look at the revolutions that take place that explain why, beginning in the 1500s approximately, the West and the European nations will become the dominant powers, and the significance of it all. So, first and foremost, in terms of the eras, this course starts roughly 1500 and goes to the present. Now, obviously, the numbers are a little bit arbitrary, but the medieval period, medieval age, goes roughly up to 1500. And then after the Middle Age, we get into the modern era. The modern era is broken down into time periods. You have the early modern period from about 1500 to roughly 1800. The modern period from about 1800 to 1945. And then what's called contemporary history, which is 1945, the end of World War II, to the present. So it is broken down differently by different groups, but that is how we are going to be looking at this. The medieval period was the period from roughly 500 to about 1500. So it's about 1,000 years. And during that period, the world was dominated. The most powerful societies were imperial states, like the Tang dynasty in China, the Byzantine Empire in the Mediterranean, the Mongol Empire in Eurasia. But after 1500, the European nation-states will become the dominant powers, and they will remain so until the present. And when I say European nation-states, obviously, the United States is an offshoot of that. So, how and why did this happen? What were the massive changes that took place around 1500? And why did the West and the European nations become the central powers of the world? There are several reasons, and obviously, inherently, everything is being overly simplified, but that's the nature of survey-level classes. First and foremost, geography, and this is vitally important to understand. The biggest reason that the European nations will come out on top is because they are along a horizontal axis with Asia. And throughout most of human history, humans traveled horizontally along the same longitudinal lines. Because obviously, within the same longitudinal lines, you have the same kind of plants, the same kind of animals. And in an era of limited resources, obviously, that was very important. So, throughout most of human history, humans primarily traveled horizontally. That is why when Europeans reach America, they will have better technology and they will have immunities to diseases that they've already experienced, whereas in America, they don't. It's not that there is not trading happening in the Americas, because there is. It's just the scale and scope of it was extremely less, extremely more limited than what happened in Eurasia or Europe and Asia. So between Eurasia, there was just a lot more trade going between, so there's a lot more information going back and forth, which means there was more technological advancements and there was more diseases spread, which is why the Europeans, when they get to the Americas, will have immunities to a lot of the diseases. So that is a fundamentally important reason that the Europeans will be the dominant powers. Now, very good, obvious question is, well, why were the Europeans dominant over a lot of the Asian countries? And there is no one single reason. It's a confluence of very complicated factors, but fundamentally it was because they will have structural changes and institutional changes that will lead them to create forms of government, forms of institutions, and forms of economies that are associated with prosperity in the modern era that we are talking about, 1500 to the present. As a very broad generalization, human history, since the agricultural revolution, since humans were able to start accumulating wealth and power, has been the history of a very small group of people, economically, politically, militarily, religiously, oppressing the majority. And especially economically, because it is a small group of people extracting the wealth out of the majority of the population. There's a lot of terms for it: totalitarian governments, autocratic governments, absolutist governments, dictatorships. But that is the history of humanity. Small group of people or an individual extracting the wealth out of the majority of the population. That is the governments that the world had seen before this. That is that's what imperial states were. And in Europe, they will start developing governments that are more inclusive. Instead of being extractive, they're inclusive. They're more open because they're more pluralistic. It means instead of being one individual or one group or one religion that has all the power, there are several of them. And when you have several of them, it leads to more pluralistic institutions. So that is a broad overview of why Europe will end up becoming the most powerful area. And there are a lot of reasons for that. So we will go through several of the factors that will lead Europe to becoming the world power, to becoming the most powerful area, and which of course will eventually spread to the United States. First and foremost, Europe and Asia will experience a massive massive plague. The Black Death, or the bubonic plague, it spread through Europe in the 1300s, but it will come and go until the 1600s. And it absolutely devastated Europe. The numbers vary wildly, but it killed somewhere between 30 and 50% of the European population. Usually 30% is the number you usually hear. And obviously this had some massive implications for all of Europe. It's kind of like COVID, that the consequences, the social, the economic, the political consequences are so massive that we won't fully understand them for decades. But the Black Death was obviously had I don't know if you could say the bigger impact, but it was more devastating because obviously they didn't have vaccinations like we do now. But of the many factors, of the many consequences of it, what it led to was an obvious labor shortage. The population of Europe was absolutely devastated. And when there was a labor shortage, Eastern and Western Europe will take two different paths. In Eastern Europe, when there was a labor shortage, workers, the Eastern European countries, will pass laws to restrict workers' rights. So farmers, instead of being able to move off the land and go find better landowners, or better work, Eastern European nations will pass laws restricting workers' rights, restricting farmers' rights. They would pass laws forcing workers to stay on the land. And if they tried to leave, they would be executed. So, obviously, they will go in a more authoritarian direction. In Western Europe, as a broad generalization, the demand for workers will lead to workers having more rights and getting better conditions. Landowners in Western Europe will have to compete for the labor of the workers. So, very, very gradually, and this is a very gradual, long process, the workers will start getting a little bit more rights. They will be able to demand a little bit more pay, better conditions, because the landowners will have to compete for the labor. They will have to make it enticing to get laborers to come work on their land. So that is a revolutionary pandemic that will lead Eastern and Western Europe to start going in different directions. Eastern Europe will go into a more authoritarian, totalitarian direction, and Western Europe will go in a gradually more inclusive direction, where workers will get a little bit more rights, a little bit more power, and it's very little bit, but it will start moving in that direction. Another massive revolution that takes place in Western Europe is a technological revolution that has massive implications, a communication revolution. How significant and how big this is impossible to state. For the time, it was like the equivalent of the creation of the internet in the sheer scale of it. The revolutions in communications change everything about society, and this is one of the first and biggest ones. Besides the creation of writing itself, the creation of the printing press meant that now information can be more widely disseminated. It will be the largest communication revolution until we get the telegraph in the 1840s. The creation of the printing press by the German Johannes Gutenberg in 1439 will completely change the spread of information, and it will lead to an intellectual and scientific revolution, and it will lead to all sorts of changes. So this one invention had so many other repercussions and so many consequences. But one of the most important things is just being able to disseminate information more widely, which obviously means then information can be built upon. And the spread of information, the spread of knowledge, the printing press itself will be directly responsible for a religious revolution. The Catholic Church was the only church in the Western Hemisphere for a long time until a German monk and theologian named Martin Luther touched off what's called the Protestant Reformation. With the Protestant Reformation, all of a sudden, there was now a challenge. So there are three religions. This is something that everyone should know. There's three religions of the book. When you say of the book, that means the Old Testament. Those are Jews, Muslims, and Christians. All three use the Old Testament. What makes Christians different is the New Testament. And until the Protestant Reformation, 1517, there was Eastern Orthodox. That is in Russia is an Eastern Orthodox. A lot of Eastern European countries. Also Alaska, if you ever see crosses that instead of being like this, it's like this at an angle, that is an Eastern Orthodox. That's Eastern Orthodox Christianity. So there's Eastern Orthodox, and then there's Catholic Church. With the Protestant Reformation, now there was a whole nother branch of Christianity, and from Protestantism, you have an explosion. If Protestantism includes Baptists, Methodists, Lutherans, Calvinists, Church of England, Mormons. I mean, it includes everything else that is not Catholic and Eastern Orthodox. So now instead of having one religion, now you have multiple religions. And what that means is you have a lot of religions competing against each other. So when you have only one religion, obviously then that is authoritarian. That's called a theocracy. Well, now you have multiple religions that are competing against each other. So that is a major consequence of the printing press, and it wouldn't have happened without the printing press. Because now with the printing press, Martin Luther and his 95 Theses are spread all over, and it changes the way people think about religion. It also, of course, led to a scientific revolution. There's a scientific and intellectual revolution that takes place, and all of a sudden, now, the Middle Ages are remembered for the dogmas and superstitions. And that is now replaced with critical thought, humanistic inquiry, and empirical experimentation, the scientific method. So now, instead of there being a very limited amount of views, a limited amount of beliefs, all of a sudden ideas are now flourishing, and they are spreading because of the printing press. There's a very good reason why it was illegal to teach slaves how to read in the U.S. South. If you want to keep people oppressed, the most important thing is do not let them be educated. People emphasize guns as being the most important, but we have plenty of examples of societies where there's a lot of guns, but people are not educated. Being educated is the most important thing to being a free society. And so now we have an intellectual and scientific revolution. So now you have a lot of religions, but you also have a lot of ideas, a lot of intellectual ideas that are spreading. And so this has massive implications to the way people think, and people inherently, when they become more educated, they want more freedom. So there's an intellectual revolution, a scientific revolution, a religious revolution, and also related to the invention of the printing press and the spread of information is the invention of new ships, new types of ships, new types of sails, and new navigational instruments. Now, these new inventions led to a huge change in society's trade. The invention of new ships, new sails, new navigational tools, a lot of them came from China and Arabic countries. A lot of them were Chinese and Arabic inventions. Europe, however, will benefit more than Asian and Arabic countries because they will, Chinese and Arabic countries will have more authoritarian governments. And they will intentionally, a lot of them will intentionally try to cut off trade, because when there's more trade, you get more freedom, and if you're a dictator, you don't want that, obviously. In Europe, though, they will take those inventions, and they will benefit the most from this age of exploration, age of discovery. That is why it is the European nations. It's debatable whether they are the first ones that will reach America. There's evidence that might have been other groups, but they're the ones that are able to take advantage of trade with the rest of the world. And it will start with the Spanish and the Portuguese, but then it will, then France and England, of course, will also benefit from it. So France, England, Portugal, the Netherlands, and Spain become the countries that are most able to globalize. They are the ones that are able to take advantage of international trade and globalization. And that will be important because now these countries are competing against each other. So you have the nations in competition. Competition is good for society as a whole. That's why monopolies are bad. It's generalization. And this age of exploration, this age of discovery, will lead to the establishment of an economic revolution. So we have a technological revolution, the printing press, also new ships. We have a religious revolution. We have an intellectual revolution. And now there's an economic revolution. The economic revolution is the creation of privately owned companies. These privately owned companies, when I say private, it means it's not owned and controlled by the government. These privately owned companies are called joint stock companies. A joint stock company is the precursor to a modern-day corporation. And there were a lot of them, but the most important ones that are created by the Dutch and the British. The Dutch and the British will establish trade networks all throughout the world, and they will become the commercial and global commercial powers and will most benefit from globalization. This is really important, that they are the ones that create the most important joint stock companies, the most efficient private commercial organizations, because the way these joint stock companies work is a bunch of individuals are able to pool their wealth or put their money together for some sort of business venture. If the venture fails, that means everyone loses less, but if it succeeds, that means everyone gets paid out more. That is essentially how the stock market works. If a company is on the stock market and you buy a stock, you're basically pooling your wealth for that company. So that way the risk is spread out. The reason this is so important, the reason joint stock companies are so important, is because they will help Western Europe in the formation of, or in the creation of capitalism. Now, these private companies are leading to individuals becoming independently wealthy. And when those individuals become independently wealthy, all of a sudden, you have very wealthy individuals who are now going to demand more rights. So rather than there being just one authoritarian leader, all of a sudden you have a bunch of individuals that become incredibly wealthy. Well, do rich people think they are important, should have rights and powers? Of course they do. So it's this rich merchant class that will challenge, not even challenge, but they will demand more rights, which is why capitalism is it has a lot of problems, but it is still the best economic system that we've ever found. With capitalism, now you have economic diversity. That's one of the reasons that a lot of the countries, like in Asia, they will stop international trade from happening. They will, in like China and Japan, they actually make laws saying you cannot trade. Because once you get merchants that are able to trade, then they start getting wealthy, and then they get wealthy, and then they will challenge the ruling elite, or whatever monarchy, whatever authoritarian state. So if you are a dictator, then you don't want a capitalist system, because then you'll get people that will become rich and will challenge you. So Western Europe will develop a more capitalist system, and the two countries that will especially benefit from it are the Dutch and the British. In fact, the Dutch creates what I think it's the most profitable company in all of human history, the Dutch East India Company. So the companies are still monopolistic. So when I say capitalism, we're talking about the very beginnings of capitalism. But it's a challenge to the authoritarian states. It's a challenge to the monarchs. And over time, it will force the monarchs to have to share power. So there's an economic revolution. And there's also a political revolution. During this period, by 1500, the governments in Europe will start centralizing power. There will be centralized governments in Europe, and they will start creating nation states. Now, obviously, at the time, these are they're all monarchs. There were absolute monarchs, there's constitutional monarchs, different kind of monarchs. But this is really important to know, if you are going to have a capitalist system, you have to have a strong central government. Now, obviously, it can be too strong. You don't want that. But without any government, you cannot have capitalism. So we're living through a period now where a lot of people say government's bad, and that's just ridiculous. If you want to know what a country looks like that doesn't have a centralized government, look at Morocco, look at Mexico. Mexico does have a centralized government, but it does not have the power the drug cartels do. But if you go look at countries all over the world that don't have a strong centralized government, Afghanistan, they are chaotic. So you do need to have a strong centralized government. And during this period, there is a political revolution where they will start creating centralized governments. And those centralized governments will develop large standing armies and also modern ways to finance the country through taxation. I know taxation is terrible, it's awful, but if you are going to have a stable nation, you have to have taxation. This isn't to say taxation is good or bad. Try to get away from the idea that governments are good or bad, or taxation is good or bad. It is, how is it used? Is it used effectively? And so you start getting you start getting centralized governments that have the power to tax, and so they can create large standing armies. And once you start getting these nations, now in Europe what you're getting is a bunch of countries that are competing with each other. And remember, competition is very good for a society. It is what leads to improvements. That's why capitalism is the best economic system we found. And it's why Europe will advance. When you have all these nations competing with each other, obviously they want to have the best technology. They will develop new technology. So competition is good. Now you have religious competition because you have multiple religions. You have intellectual competition, spread of ideas. You have economic competition between the nations, between the companies, and you have national competition. So that is why in the 1500s, Europe will start moving away from the rest of the world and will eventually become the world superpower. It's because of all these revolutions that are taking place. So, what is the key takeaway? What is the key takeaway of this? First and foremost, during this period, we see the beginning of globalization. And globalization is also one of those things that people think it's bad, but from 1500 to the present, the countries that are able to globalize and effectively use globalization, they are the world powers. Globalization is the process by which trade, ideas, technology, and even diseases are spread all throughout the world. So it creates an interconnectedness and an interdependence between nations. Western Europe was the Western European nations were the ones that were able to take advantage of this most, especially England and the Netherlands, or the Dutch. Spain and Portugal, they are able to take advantage of it, but we will talk later about why they fall behind the Dutch and especially England. But this linked the Eastern Hemisphere with the Western Hemisphere, and it is the big reason that it is a major reason European people and European nations were able to benefit from the increased trade, increased power, increased wealth, increased competition that will shift society and make Europe into the center of power by the 1700s. And it is because of that trade network that happens all over the world. The one that is especially important is the Columbian Exchange. And that is the trade network between Europe and America. So the trade network that is established is the globalization, the trade, is what will make the European nations into the superpower. Related to that, obviously, is the fact that the European nations will start moving away from what had been the norm throughout human history. The small group of people, or the lone individual, dominating the rest of society, because the European nations are able to develop what's called pluralism. It's called pluralism, but it is the creation of institutions that are inclusive. That means it includes a lot. And when I say inclusive, that doesn't mean that everyone loves each other. It means they dislike each other, but there's so many of them that no one group, no one individual is able to get all the power. So don't think of inclusiveness the way people think of now, like being accepting of everyone. Inclusive means that there are multiple competing factions, and there are so many that no one group is able to actually gain complete control. So during this period, we see pluralism, and we see the creation of inclusive institutions. So there is intellectual pluralism, because there are more ideas, obviously, is when we realize that the Earth actually isn't the center of the universe. We get religious pluralism. This is very important because the Protestant Reformation will not only challenge the Catholic Church, but it will force the Catholic Church itself to have to change to adjust to the times. But this is really important because it means religious diversity, which leads to religious freedom. And cannot stress this point enough. Religious freedom is absolutely fundamental to a nation's prosperity. Religious freedom, it doesn't mean the absence of governments. For some reason, I hear a lot people say that freedom is the absence of government, and that is not accurate. Sure, historically governments can be the most oppressive thing, but anything can be oppressive. Whatever has the power, religions can be oppressive. Of course, governments can be oppressive. Militaries can be oppressive, which is part of the government, but labor unions can be oppressive. And as we will eventually see, corporations can be more oppressive than the government. So anything can be oppressive. It is depending on what has the power. And when you have, one thing is very clear. Rule by a religion, or what's called a theocracy, that is bad for a country. And I have gotten pushback on this. If anyone can show me an example of a theocracy that is a free and open society, or even that's an economic powerhouse, by all means, do show me, because they don't exist. If you look up the theocracies in the world right now, there's like 7 true theocracies, and you don't want to live in any of them. So we get religious pluralism. We also get economic pluralism. With the globalization, with the trade throughout the world, merchants were able to become wealthier, and they were able to challenge the landed nobility. So throughout most of Europe, there was, this hereditary nobility, which you'd be rich and you'd own all the lands, and you had some title like prince or king, and you gave that to your kids, you gave that to your kids. Well, now all of a sudden you have some individuals that are becoming incredibly rich that are able to challenge these landed nobility. And so what that means is the creation of a pluralistic economic institution, which is capitalism. And capitalism, for all of its problems, it's still the greatest economic system the world has ever seen. Capitalist system means, in capitalist system, there's greater economic and social mobility. And really importantly, make sure you know this, capitalism is not the absence of government interference. In order to have a capitalist system, you have to have a strong central government. Because if you are going to have a stable system, you have to have a strong central government. If you're going to have a system that protects private property, that protects inventions, you have to have a strong central government. So the creation of the central governments allowed for the creation of capitalism. And it's really important you understand what capitalism is. It's a very complicated topic. There are entire graduate classes that deal with the issue of capitalism, but at the most base level, and the way we are going to use it for this course, capitalism is private ownership of the means of production and distribution. When I say private, I mean private, like not owned by the government, so private individuals. That is the basis of capitalism. It's private ownership of the means of production and distribution. Again, that is an oversimplification, but that is fundamentally the basis of capitalism. So you now have economic pluralism, and relatedly, you have political and national pluralism. By the late 1400s, Europe had created regional states. There was Italy, Spain, France, England, and Russia. Instead of having centralized empires, you now had states. You now had nations. Now, obviously, within those states and nations, usually the power was centralized in a monarch, but the fact that you had multiple nations, multiple states, meant that now they were in competition with each other. And because they were in competition with each other, you had pluralism. So you have pluralistic nationalism, which over time eventually will lead to pluralistic political institutions, namely democracy. And this is very important to understand. Pluralism in politics, if you have a pluralistic political system that is a bunch of different entities that are competing for power, that is the basis of a democratic government. It doesn't, again, pluralism doesn't mean everyone gets along. It means everyone doesn't get along, but there's so many of them that they're all competing. And democracy, to quote Winston Churchill, democracy is the worst form of government besides all the rest of them. In human history, a democratic form of government is still the best government that we've ever found. And obviously, the United States is not a pure democracy. And Western Europe, they won't have pure democracy either. In fact, you can't find an example of a large nation that is a pure democracy that works. Pure democracy doesn't work. It's a representative democracy. We elect representatives that form some sort of a legislature. So political pluralism is democracy. Economic pluralism, you get capitalism. And then religious pluralism, you get religious freedom and separation of church and state. Those three things are associated with long-term growth and stability. In contrast to that is authoritarianism and extractive institutions. That is what most of human history is. A small group of people, an individual or small group of people extracting the wealth from the rest of the population. It is centralized power and authority in one individual or one party or one religion. And that institution, that individual, that party, they have no restrictions. So there's no legislature or courts or economic elite that can challenge their authority. So authoritarian governments are the norm throughout human history. Authoritarian governments that are extracting the wealth, they're the norms. And there's a lot of examples of different kinds of them. Absolutism, like monarchies, oligarchies that is ruled by a small group of rich elites, monarchies themselves, obviously, theocracies ruled by religion, fascism, which we'll talk about later, socialism, communism. Theoretically, those are supposed to be ruled by people, but in practice, every socialist and communist government is an authoritarian state. Whether you're talking about Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam, Russia, currently, obviously, Vladimir Putin, but every example of socialist and communist governments that call themselves socialist communists, in reality, they're just authoritarian. And there are some key features to pluralistic versus authoritarian societies. And in pluralistic society, you have multiple entities that are competing for power. There is a central government, because you need a central government to enforce laws and create stability, but there are voting rights, which is obviously a gradual thing, and it will take a long time for Western Europe to develop these. Even in the United States, it takes obviously a long time before blacks are given the right to vote, minorities are given the right to vote in general, women are given the right to vote. And so it's a process. But fundamental to that also is freedom of speech and freedom of the press. When an authoritarian government takes over, or when an individual takes over government, one of the very first things that they do is they take over the press, they take over the media. That way they can get away with whatever they want without it being reported to the population. One of the key signs of a country that is losing its democratic status is the government takes over the media. And you lose freedom of speech, freedom of press. So this is how pluralism will start develops. And this concept is so important for you to understand. That human history is the history of extractive institutions. When I say extractive, again, it means monarchy, oligarchy, party, or a religion that is extracting the wealth from the majority of the population. In order to do that, they obviously cannot let the population vote. They cannot let the population have rights. And they cannot share power. So there's no balance of power. There's no balance between the individual elite, the oligarchy, the religion or whatever, and the courts or the legislature. So there's no balance of power in extractive institutions. These things go together. Economic inclusiveness and political inclusiveness versus economic extractive institutions and political extractive institutions work together. Once you start losing one of them, you start losing the other ones. In my introduction lecture, I talked about right now in world history, we're experiencing 18 straight years of the decline of democracy. And these things, it's very rare that they just suddenly burst and you lose them. But countries all over the world are seeing these things in decline. There's a term for it. It's either the virtuous circle or the vicious circle. Within a vicious circle, that means you start losing those three things: representative democracy, capitalism, and religious freedom. And which order you lose those is, it will vary by nation, it varies, but just to give you an example. So let's say you create you get a political party that gets all the power. That political party gets all the power. They then change the laws to take away people's ability to vote. So you start removing the democratic process. Then they start promoting businesses that only benefit their party. When that happens, you start getting concentrated economic and political power in one institution, one party, and usually one religion. That frequently goes together. So you start having a decline in one, and then you start having a decline in all of them. Another example is if you have one religion that has all the power, what inevitably happens is that religion starts passing laws that allows only that religion to have political rights. And then inevitably, of course, they'll change the economic system so they're the only ones that can be wealthy. So these three things will go together or they will fail together. The virtuous circle is when they are working together. There's competition in politics, pluralism, that leads to inclusive economic institutions, which means there's more competition, which competition is a key part of capitalism, which when there's competition, it means businesses have to improve in order to do better than other companies, which is good for business. And that creates growth, which creates more more inclusive, more equal institutions. So pluralism and the virtuous circle are fundamental. If you start moving away from pluralism, which is powered by one individual, powered by one political party, by one group, they will inevitably enact laws that will extract the wealth and the power from the other groups to make sure it goes to them. So these two things go together. For all of the reasons we just talked about, that is why beginning in the around 1500s, we had all sorts of revolutions take place that will lead to the power in the world becoming centered in Europe, which of course will eventually then be centered in the United States, North America, which is why the United States has been the world economic power since the 1870s and the world military power since 1945. Well, probably 1939, the beginning of World War II. The United States became the world superpower, and it's because of this gradual shift from autocracy, from dictatorships, from extractive institutions to pluralistic and inclusive institutions.